Could you explain to me what it is, what global warming is in terms of Mexican species, what kind of threat it poses?
Yes, so I think a key point is that global warming isn't a crisis that's decades away. It's happening now, and it's impacting species across the globe in Mexico and animals and plants around the globe everywhere that we look. And so some of the things that we're seeing are that in Mexico and around the globe are that many species are trying to keep up with climate change and are moving poleward and upward in elevation. Many of them are losing their food sources and the places that they need to live. And some, like polar bears in the Arctic or corals off the Mexican coast, are declining or collapsing. And so the cost of inaction in addressing climate change is already having a terrible toll on wildlife, on this web of life that we all depend on for our fundamental needs. And so one key point of the negotiations here in Cancun is setting the target, the global target for limiting temperature rise or for limiting the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and setting a safe level that protects ourselves and biodiversity. And so if we look at the Copenhagen pledges, so the pledges that countries have put at the table already, those would lead to a temperature rise estimated between 2.5 degrees Celsius and 5 degrees Celsius, so an average of about 3.5. And that level is what scientists have said. So that level of 3.5 is what scientists have said would condemn a third of the world's plants and animals to extinction by mid-century, by 2050, and threaten up to 2/3 with extinction by the end of the century. So clearly, that is an unsustainable road that we can't go down, both for the web of life and for ourselves. And so an important target to protect biodiversity and ourselves is 350 parts per million of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. We're already at 390 parts per million. We're already too high, and as I've said, has seen devastating effects already across the globe. And that concentration of 350 roughly corresponds to limiting temperature rise to about 1.5 degrees Celsius, with which many nations are calling for here, especially those nations whose survival is at risk. So.
But the number that's on the table is 2%, isn't it? So it's 2%, 2 degrees.
Well, in the negotiating text for the shared vision right now, there are bracketed text that of 1 degree Celsius, 1.5 and 2, and for limiting carbon dioxide to 350 parts per million. The Copenhagen Accord calls for less than 2 degrees, limiting temperature to 2 degrees Celsius. But in terms of the international negotiations here, those other targets that are more protective are still on the table.
What would it take to reach a 1.5 degree rise, though?
Yes, so there are scenarios that scientists have modeled showing us how we can get or stay below 1.5 degrees Celsius. And some of the key points are that globally, emissions across developed and developing countries would need to be cut by a large amount, by about 40% below 1990 levels by 2020. So that's a far cry from what countries have pledged. For example, the United States, their Copenhagen pledge equates to about 3% below 1990 by 2020, when indeed it needs to be closer to 40% if we were to meet a 1.5 degrees Celsius temperature rise. There are more other pathways to reach 1.5 that are a little less restrictive on our near-term global emissions reductions, but they would require that we institute technologies toward the end of the century, 2050 or beyond, to draw carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere to create what's called net negative emissions. So things like afforestation and carbon capture and storage. Another key point to reach a 1.5 target is the peak year, so the year in which global emissions have to reach their peak and then decline afterward. And that, for 1.5 target, must be before the year 2015. So it leaves us a small window of opportunity, a shrinking window of opportunity to act, but an incredibly important opportunity right now.
So we've got 4 years in which we can carry on emitting and emitting, and then
must drop rapidly thereafter. Peak and drop. So,
okay. What are you hoping to achieve from the conference, from your point of view?
Yeah, one of the Center for Biological Diversity's key purposes here, since we are a U.S.-based NGO, is one of our main missions is to prevent species extinction. And we have done a lot of work to protect the polar bear under U.S. domestic law, under the Endangered Species Act, due to the impacts of climate change. Is first of all to raise awareness about what's happening, the impacts that are happening to biodiversity around the world already, that our current level of 390 parts per million is already too high, and that we need to reduce to 350 parts per million. And secondly, to raise awareness that under our own domestic law in the United States, we already have many tools for getting to that 350 target. So for example, the Obama administration can already enforce our Clean Air Act in the United States to get us a long way, to get us a good portion of the way to that 350 target, and to get started now rather than blocking progress as the U.S. has been doing in these negotiations. The Obama administration actually has a lot of ability to act now.
Explain to me the extent of the influence on coral reefs in Mexico then.
The climate crisis is threatening coral reefs with collapse, likely in the next few decades. And coral reefs are so important, not only because they harbor an estimated 1/3 of marine species, but also because they are crucial to the livelihoods of 500 million people around the globe, incredibly important. And corals are being hit by ocean warming and ocean acidification. So this year, we've seen around the globe, including the Caribbean, that corals have experienced a mass bleaching event where in some places 50% of the corals have been bleached. Bleaching occurs when corals are experiencing warm water conditions for extended periods. They turn white and they are susceptible to death and disease. Another tremendous threat to corals, which is why they're so on the verge of collapse, is ocean acidification. So while many people know that carbon is polluting the atmosphere, many people are less aware that it's also polluting our oceans, that the oceans have absorbed about 1/3 of the carbon dioxide that we have emitted, and that is making the oceans more acidic, and one consequence of that is that it makes it more difficult for corals to build their shells and skeletons. So corals are already being hindered in building their protective armor. So right now, as I've mentioned, we're at the carbon dioxide level of 390 parts per million. That's already too high for corals. Scientists have said to protect coral reefs from collapse, we must get down to 350 parts per million or below. At 320 parts per million, we started witnessing these mass bleaching events of corals around the globe. And at a level of 450 parts per million, which is not that much higher than we are now, corals will stop being able to grow. That erosion of corals will kind of eclipse their ability to grow. And at not much higher than that, at 560 parts per million, all corals will start to dissolve. So in terms of ecosystems and species that are really at the front lines of extinction due to climate change, corals are among the most imperiled. And also, if we look to the Arctic species that are rapidly losing their sea ice.
Okay, thank you ever so much for your time.
Okay, thank you.